It was taken over 6 months and numerous extensions, but finally today the business rescue plan for the national carrier was approved by creditors. The new flight path for SAA got the support of 86% of the banks and other creditors it owes money to. Meanwhile, SAA's chief commercial officer for the past year, Philip Saunders, has been appointed the airline's interim CEO. Editor of SA Flyer magazine, Guy Leach, had this to say about the appointment.
He has already been at SAA for a number of years. He has got a good track record at SAA. In fact, I think that he's been remarkably successful behind the scenes over the past couple of weeks and months, returning most of SAA's fleet to its lessors, which must have been a huge task given the current condition of the actual airline industry and the reluctance of lessors to take their aircraft behind. So I think he's accomplished an awful lot. I think he's a fellow who's been appointed on the basis of competence rather than any other reason. So for that reason, there is some comfort that the airline may have a chance going forward, but not much.
Well, aviation analyst Desmond Latham joins me now. Good evening, Des. Thanks very much for your time. The big question, of course, is show me the money. What is the Department of Public Enterprise saying, and what is National Treasury saying? Because there's been a little bit of a mismatch about that messaging.
Isn't there just? I mean, you could call it schizophrenia in a way, because they're both apparently part of the state bodies, but I think you can say the DPEs are going to issue a letter tomorrow, they have to by law, stating where the money is coming from and who is interested in purchasing what's left of SAA or being part of the restructuring process. Now, the big problem for this, if you look at it, is that Tito Mboweni has made it very clear that he's not going to provide more cash for it. And in the midterm budget or the emergency budget, he had no details about that. But it is a political hot potato at the moment. So I'd imagine that from what I'm hearing, there have been some Middle Eastern airlines wandering around the streets. I bumped into one or two individuals who showed some interest from Qatar, for example. So there's an idea here that, you know, that this is a time to think in the future, seize the moment, and to invest in some kind of dream for aviation for the SADC region, and some kind of reconstructed international SAA might be part of that.
Well, that sounds potentially hopeful, that there might be someone who can partner to introduce this new SAA, which we're hoping does materialise. Let's just talk about the money, though, in the meantime, because my understanding is that the business rescue plan is about 10 billion rand, but the banks, which are guaranteed their full money back, they're owed 16 billion rand, which I think has to be paid out over 3 years. Of course, the retrenchment packages alone are going to cost over 2 billion, so that's already over 10 billion. I don't understand the sums. Talk me through it.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Where is that money coming from? If you look at possible partners in the BRICS, only China has that kind of cash, and it's not really clear at the moment. They're facing too many of their own threats in their own region to possibly come play here and invest in an airline, despite all the rumors that have been going on about this. Secondly, the fact that the amounts touted here are leading have added to the 30 billion rand that is floating around, that is also owed. And you've got to also keep in mind the creditors. I've looked at the list of creditors, and there's a lot of leasing companies, and these are the smaller investors. They owe 200 million rand, for example. These are mainly American and European and some Australian leasing companies. They're not going to be very happy, and they've been left out of this deal largely because the large creditors, we're looking at banks, as you've said. And the banks, of course, are tied to the state of South Africa through the bonds, government bonds, ownership that they have, and also the long-term threat to their own business model. So you can imagine managers sitting in these positions saying, okay, we'll kick this can another few years down the road because I'm not going to make the decision to lose this kind of money. So, I mean, the reality is international aviation transport is down by 70 to 90%. In Africa, it's 90%. If you look in Africa, if you fly internationally now, every airline that's flying is losing $42 per passenger per flight. So what kind of magic elixir is the reconstructed SAA executive and board going to produce to get around the facts that we're in a pandemic?
And then if we look at Comair, they're not guaranteed their full money. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Des, is that they're getting 7.5 cents to the rand in this deal, which means they're not going to get much of their money back at all. So what potential impact will this have on Comair and their ability to stay in the skies?
Well, you know, one of the terrible stories that that's happened in aviation recently is that Comrie was basically has been profitable its entire existence until their last reporting period, and then they went immediately into business rescue. But they made a number of missteps. It's not just the fact that 790 million rand is owed to them by SAA because of monopolistic tendencies and a fine, which they're always quoting in their bottom line, but they made two other serious missteps. The first was that they changed their maintenance from SAA because they're fighting with SAA, obviously. So they moved to Lufthansa, and of course that's based in Frankfurt, and it also thinks in euros. So that was a serious misstep made by the management. Then, of course, the whole board there changed essentially, starting with this chief financial officer. And the second misstep they made is that they costed their hedging incorrectly based on fuel, and so. They are also up a creek. They have until November, and apparently will start flying in November. But at the moment, Flight SAA is flying. I'm a pilot. I flew from Lanseria the other night, and there was Flight SAA, full aeroplanes, flying out of Lanseria and, of course, ORT and so on. So the competitors are flying high domestically at the moment, but they're ready, and they're very big plans, from what I'm hearing, to take this across the border. So, that's the picture at the moment. The competitors are flying, Airlink, Fly SAA. What is SAA? Mango has made a profit before it was shut down because of the COVID threat. So will SAA and Mango be re-merged somehow? How is this all going to pan out? You've got to look at Mango and SAA together, along with Airships and SAA Maintenance and their cargo facility, and say, what's going on here? I think it's a sleight of hand myself, and I think the banks and the larger creditors are playing with government at the moment because they have a serious threat. And the smaller creditors, I feel, may take legal action here because there's not a logical, sustainable model that comes out of this in the short term. No ways.
We've seen the pilots very unhappy. The SAA pilots really were the ones who are not happy with. Even the unions basically said, look, it's not ideal, but at least we've got something with this business rescue plan. What does this mean for the pilots? They're the people who keep the planes in the sky.
Well, being one myself, I am subjective about this, but I'm not a commercial pilot. I'm a private pilot, but I climb in an airplane and look at the numbers and fly it around at night. So, you've got to say the following. The first thing is SAA pilots have been paid along the lines of international best practice, which you need if you're going to put 150 to 300 people behind you. You don't want to crash into what we call the granite cloud with 300 people behind you, so you need high-skilled staff flying that plane. They're going to get around R1 billion of the bailout, and they're asking for a more creditable long-term solution because they're getting 1 week per year, and they're saying that it's not going to cover their costs. At the moment, though, they don't have a lot of negotiating power because, of course, United Airlines last week announced that 45% of its staff are going to be terminated or retrenched or furloughed, and a few thousand of those are actual pilots. So you can see that around the world we're beginning to have this situation develop where highly experienced pilots will be hired going down the line, 10, 15, 20-year pilots, but the ones who are sitting in the right seat, the first officer with maybe 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 hour flying, will be looking around for a job. So the South African pilots who are playing hardball at the moment don't have a lot of negotiating room to play with. Although, subjectively speaking, I have a lot of sentiment towards them, but I think they've got to be very careful here. They've got to realize that if they're going to any forum at the moment that talks about aviation in a professional way, they'll see what I'm seeing and that the jobs are not there. So maybe become an IT expert or something.
And there's also today the announcement of the interim CEO, Philip Saunders, who's been with the airline for about a year. And I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that he's got to work now with the business rescue practitioners to sort out the airline. How do you think that's going to work?
Well, that's interesting because, behind the business rescue practitioners is an American company that has been working in the aviation sector for a short while, although they have high-skilled people involved with them at the moment. And we understand, or I've been following that company for a while, and so behind De Guana and Matiston are these proficient international experts, also, by the way, working with EDCOR, trying to turn around EDCORs. They are looking at sourcing funds. And because, Southern Africa is such a large market in the future with tourism and so on, they may be able to, with Saunders and others, with the skills, the financial skills, work out a long-term plan. But what concerns me, and I've said this a number of times to other agencies, is that there is no idea of a strategy. Everything that's been done by government and so on is tactical. They're changing things based on a month by month, a quarter by quarter. They need to produce something that goes forward into 5 or 8 year cycles to excite investors for the long term to invest in a big idea. And you can only do that on a regional basis. You've got Ethiopian Airlines looking at geo routes around East Africa. You have Air Afrique in West Africa, the French airlines looking at something similar there. Something like that has to happen in the SADC region. Just floating out SAA, calling it, Air Mzansi or something is just not going to cut it. They need a big picture. They need a strategy.
Des, in one sentence, if you had to sum up the flight path for SAA in the next 6 months to a year, what would you say?
I'd say high turbulence, one wing comes off, and it's the granite cloud, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Des Latham giving us his views. Aviation expert there talking about the business rescue plan for SAA, which was approved today.